Hey guys, tonight we slip into something a little more imperial. You're standing at the rocky shore of the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, and it does not smell like victory. It smells like fermented snail guts in the August sun. Congratulations, you've arrived at the birthplace of purple dye. Not lavender, not lilac. No, this is Tyrian purple, the color so intense, so expensive, and so dramatically overrated that entire Roman emperors built their egos around it. And you poor soul are about to find out why. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're winding down. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail behind a young Phoenician boy with bare feet, hair slicked with salt, and a basket full of murky mollusks. These are Murex brandaris, prickly little sea snails with a talent for extreme inconvenience. They're not particularly friendly, fast, or edible, but they contain a gland deep in their spiral shell that if you poke it just right and wait for it to oxidize, produces a drop of deep purple pigment. Just one drop. It takes about 12,000 snails to dye a handkerchief, not even a tunic, just something you'd sneeze into and then apologize for. And of course, that means this color, this shade of blistering royalty does not come cheap. Not in labor, not in logistics, and certainly not in body odor. Tyrian purple became so wildly expensive that wearing it wasn't just fashion. It was law. It was class. It was a slightly passive-aggressive way to say I own more coastline than you. You wander past clay vats lining the shoreline. The smell hits you first, something between low tide and wet death. Workers crush snails using stones, extract the glands, and toss them into pots where the goo is left to rot under the sun. Yes, the recipe requires sunlight and patience and an iron stomach. As the mix ferments, the briny stench of imperial power rises in waves. Historians still argue whether Phoenician dye workers were revered craftsmen or simply too nose-deaf to notice. And yet people paid for this. They lined up for it. In Rome, a single ounce of Tyrian purple cost more than its weight in gold. Wearing it was more than vanity. It was a declaration that you were essentially better than everyone else. Literally holier, too. By the time Nero was around, unauthorized purple wearers could be executed. That's right. Wearing the wrong outfit could get you decapitated at brunch. You peek inside a stone building where scrolls are tied with purple-dyed cords. Even library labels flexed on people. The dye found its way onto temples, cushions, even sandals. The emperor's ceremonial slippers weren't just a little bit fancy, they could bankrupt provinces. The absurdity was part of the point. But before all that pomp came the snail. And the sand. And a kid with a basket who didn't understand why he had to collect thousands of spiny, squirming blobs just so someone miles away could parade through marble halls dressed like a bruised peacock. And you start to get it just a little. There's something about creating something that no one else can. Something that takes too much effort, smells too bad, and dies too quickly to ever be practical. But it endures because the effort itself is the message. One drop of purple from a living thing. That's what the Romans paid for. That's what they built empires to control. Fun fact, the smell of a Tyrian dye vat was so strong, ancient Greek texts described it as causing people to faint. And yet, some fringe scholars believe the olfactory punishment was considered part of the purification process, getting spiritually humbled by the odor of your own fashion. You wander a bit further down the shore. The tide pulls in more snails. The sun starts to dip behind the crumbled ruins of another dye house. You look down and spot a broken pot rim still stained purple. Just a whisper of empire catching the last light of the day. You wake before dawn to the sound of waves murmuring against the Phoenician stone. It's quiet now, no baskets thumping, no snails hissing from crushed shells, just the hush of salt and seagulls, and the low chant of something older than Rome. You stretch groggy as a dye worker lights a small fire beside a vat that hasn't cooled in days. Tyrian purple never sleeps, apparently. Neither do you. Back in Rome, purple is more than a color. It's a currency. Senators wear it stitched as a border along their togas, a narrow ribbon of authority called the latus clavis. The wider the band, the more power you supposedly radiate. Emperor full-body purple drape naturally. Middle-class merchant hoping no one notices your wine is watered down. Better stick to beige. You trudge through a Roman marketplace. There's bustle, baker carts, wine amphorae, and a man trying to convince a crowd that his grapes have been blessed by Apollo. But your eyes catch the fabric merchant, his tent laced with fluttering silks and wool dyed in dusty ochre modest indigo, and one brilliant square of purple. It glows like a bruise in sunlight. No price tag. You don't need one. The merchant doesn't even touch it. It's on a pedestal, behind glass. Guards hover. There's one woman squinting at it, adjusting her tunic nervously. She asks if it's legal for her to purchase. The merchant just smiles and reminds her unless she's got an imperial seal or a death wish, she'd better walk away. Historians still argue whether purple laws were truly enforced or mostly symbolic. Did soldiers actually march into dinner parties and arrest someone for a flamboyant sash? Or was it more about social cues? An unspoken agreement that the rich stay flashy and everyone else knows their place. Of course, human nature being what it is, knockoffs were inevitable. Enter the purpurari. Underground dyers who tried to replicate the imperial hue using cheaper ingredients. Think beetroot wine dregs, even crushed flowers. The results patchy at best. Some poor senators showed up to court looking like they'd rolled in grape jelly. Fashion crimes, literally. You step into a Roman home now, rich with mosaics and perfumed oils. A party is brewing. Servants arrange couches and guests trickle in tunic hems, dragging and sandals clapping against the marble. Then he arrives, the host, wrapped in a gleaming toga edged with that unmistakable purple. Everyone hushes. Someone coughs into their wine. You notice the dye isn't just vibrant, it shimmers like the neck of a raven. Whispers start. Did he bribe a Phoenician sailor as his cousin in the Senate? Or worse, is it a fake? In the corner, a poet leans in and mutters, "If it were real, it would have smelled worse." And he's not wrong. Authentic Tyrian purple clung to everything, including your sinuses. Even after washing, the scent lingered. Which may explain why purple wearers often bathed in heavy perfumes. You weren't just announcing your status with your outfit, you were declaring war on everyone's nose. The dye's journey from snail to silk wasn't just logistical. It was spiritual too. The murex was considered sacred in some Phoenician rites, its sacrifice a ritual of transformation. One drop to bind the gods to cloth. There's even a fringe theory that some temples used purple ropes to demarcate spaces touched by the divine. A visual firewall between mortals and mysteries. You pass through a Roman temple now grand echoing smelling of myrrh and old stone. High priests enter swathed in purple stoles, not by fashion but by faith. The dye, rare as it is, becomes a bridge linking humans to Jupiter, to Mars, to Augustus himself. You wonder if the gods mind smelling like the bottom of a fish basket. As daylight fades, you return to the port. More murex are being boiled, crushed, teased for color. The dye workers are silent now, focused, reverent. One of them touches a stain on his arm, holds it to the light, and nods. The purple is good today, bold, vengeful, the kind emperors ruin friendships over. You sit near the fire and stare into the vat. The dye glows, faintly pulsing as the heat rises. You remember the poet's words and wonder how much power can really be poured into a puddle. You start the morning tracing a Roman aqueduct, the arches high above you like a giant's vertebrae stretched across the hills. It carries water, no, with lazy elegance winding from distant springs to bathhouses, fountains, and yes, dye workshops. You wonder if the water knows it's complicit in vanity. Every drop used to rinse a senator's cloak could have quenched a village. The Tyrian dye process required a lot of water, not just to soften the murex meat and rinse the shells, but to dilute and ferment the gland's pungent secretion until the correct hue emerged. The entire process was alchemical, timed to the hour, sensitive to light and jealously guarded. Like if baking sourdough could cause an international crisis. You enter one of the dye facilities near Rome, less glamorous than Phoenicia's coastal labs, but bustling. The vats are steaming, the snails are stinking, and a boy is fanning smoke into a chamber where threads are curing in silence. You're handed a mask. Even in your dreams, the smell is personal. Historians still argue whether Roman dye shops were as widespread in Italy as some records suggest, or whether most purple remained an import. Some argue only the finishing steps happened inland. Others claim Rome had its own secret stash of murex mollusks harvested from less famous shores. You climb to a balcony and look over the workshop. There are scribes taking notes, cloths hung to dry, arguments over shade purity. One dyer swears the current batch is too blue. Another says it's imperially purple, whatever that means. A third just throws their hands in the air and mumbles about quitting to become a baker. Meanwhile, deep in the harbor warehouse is a crisis brews. You descend again, slipping through back alleys and crates stamped with shipping seals. An older merchant stands pacing. His hands shake slightly. He tells you between gulps of lukewarm wine that the last Tyrian shipment from Sidon is missing. Gone. Not delayed. Vanished. 100 amphorae of unrefined dye. Enough for dozens of imperial robes or just one truly ridiculous curtain set. This isn't the first time it's happened. There are stories of pirates, of storms, of Phoenician smugglers double-dealing with Parthians. But now the tension is different. There's a wedding coming up, a political one, and the bride's family expects purple. You follow the merchant as he rushes to the forum to plead with senators. Use indigo, one shrugs. Use gold, another jokes. Use your imagination, suggests a philosopher sipping diluted honey water. None of them offer real help. That's when you realize this dye isn't just luxury, it's leverage. Whoever controls the supply controls ceremony status and subtle humiliation. If your rival wears true purple and you don't, everyone notices and pretends they don't, and then tells their neighbors anyway. To stall the merchant visits a local artist, a man who specializes in blending deceptive pigments. He proposes a trick layer, crimson and deep blue with fine brush strokes. From a distance, it might pass for Tyrian. In candlelight, if no one breathes too hard. The merchant sighs. It's either this or break off the alliance. Fringe tales say some Roman weddings were ruined when the bride's veil was found to be plum, not purple. One poet joked the groom annulled it before the wine was poured. Another account mentions a governor's son being exiled not for treason but for wearing a toga of unapproved hue. Meanwhile, the workers in the dye house keep boiling, staining, swearing. One old woman says she once knew a priest who could tell a fake purple by smell alone. Another replies that anyone can do that, the real thing smells like a sea god's laundry basket. You head back towards the port at dusk. The amphorae are still missing. A barge returns empty. Someone suggests sabotage. Someone else whispers maybe the emperor is hoarding. The air grows colder. The purple is fading from more than just fabric. You drift toward the Palatine Hill where the homes are larger, the servants quieter, and the gossip thicker than amphora clay. Here, purple isn't just a color, it's a statement. A whisper in silk. A punchline in plum. You pass a garden where peacocks strut like they know something about hue exclusivity. One has a feather missing. You're pretty sure it ended up on a senator's hat. Inside one villa, a matron wails softly as her slaves unwrap the wrong tunic. "This isn't imperial," she hisses. "This is grape." You can't really tell the difference under the torchlight, but she can. And that's the problem. Her son is supposed to give a speech at the temple tomorrow, and Grape screams, "Second cousin, not future consul." A trembling servant offers to dab it with saffron. Another suggests holding it over violet smoke. A third wisely runs. The matron waves them off and demands someone fetch her husband. He has connections in Ostia. He also owes her 3 favors and 1 apology. Meanwhile, in a dusty back room of the Temple of Jupiter, a priest adjusts the altar cloth. It's faded a little threadbare and, oh no, just slightly too blue. He sighs. Jupiter probably doesn't care, but the visiting dignitaries from Alexandria will. There's talk of a color inspection. A color inspection. Like an audit but for pigment. You sneak behind him and find a ledger. Rows and rows of fabric requisitions, purple for processions, purple for banquets, purple for funerals, even purple for the statues because apparently marble has feelings now. Historians still argue whether these quotas were enforced by law or by sheer snobbery. Some scrolls suggest edicts were passed regulating who could wear which shades. Others hint it was more of a fashion mafia break the color code and your invitations mysteriously dry up. Back outside, a young boy watches the sunset. He's holding a piece of fabric his father gave him. It's barely purple, more of a dusty mauve, but he clutches it like treasure. His father, a retired legionnaire, once guarded a caravan from Tyre. He swears one of the dye jars spilled, and he caught a drop on his sleeve. That stain, he says, brought him luck for 5 campaigns. You wander toward a shop where they sell knockoff luxuries, counterfeit rings, imitation olives, and yes, Roma purple tunics that smell vaguely of beetroot and despair. A woman haggles loudly over a scarf that looks more bruised than regal. The vendor insists it was blessed by Neptune's stylist. One fringe theory claims certain snake venom, when mixed with fig sap, can mimic the purple sheen. Another says it's just fermented mulberry juice and a prayer. Either way, the dye is missing and improvisation is on the rise. You stop by the scribes' quarters. Inside, students are practicing calligraphy with dyed inks. One girl dips her stylus in a nearly empty jar and groans. "We're out of Tyrian again," she says. "Back to crushed berries," her friend shrugs. "It all looks brown on papyrus anyway." You chuckle, but the scribes' complaints matter. If official decrees aren't stamped with purple ink, they lose some bite. The color carries legitimacy, gravitas, even fear. A letter from the emperor in Tyrian violet. You read it. A scroll in onion skin taupe. You toss it. Back on the street, a rumor spreads someone has seen a merchant unloading a sealed barrel behind the bakery. People gather, a bribe is offered. The lid creaks open. It's olives. The crowd disperses like disappointed birds. You trail a senator who walks with dramatic slowness, his cloak billowing slightly just enough to show off its fading trim. He's clearly trying to hide it, and clearly failing. He pretends not to notice 2 younger officials whispering behind a column. One points, the other giggles. The senator adjusts the hem again. That night, the city seems to hold its breath. You pass homes lit by oil lamps, their drapes pulled tight. Some families are dyeing their linens in secrecy. Others are sending servants to the outskirts in search of alternatives. There's talk of mixing ashes from redwood bark with vinegar. It'll stain, yes, but not stain. In the forum, 2 philosophers argue softly over whether color can hold meaning without scarcity. Is purple powerful because it's rare, one asks, or rare because we say it's powerful? The other just sighs and says purple is the absence of green envy and goes back to sipping something herbal. You sit by a fountain watching moonlight skim the surface like brushed silver. A cat climbs onto your lap purring. Its fur glows almost violet in the lamplight. You wonder briefly if anyone tried to dye cat hair. You hope not. The city hums on fidgeting beneath its marble skin. No one wants to say it, but everyone knows if more dye doesn't arrive soon, Rome's hierarchy will start to fray one shade at a time. The next morning, you drift with the crowd to the Subura district where life is louder, bread is cheaper, and purple is still a rumor. A boy with ink-stained fingers plays beside a dye shop. Its door locked, its jars dusty. A faded sign above reads, Authentic Tyrian. You wonder how long it's been since that claim was even remotely true. Nearby, a group of laundresses argue over a bundle of robes. One squints at a toga, holds it up to the light and mutters, amethyst, or just bad wine. The others lean in like priests, reading omens and goat entrails. Eventually, they settle on passable dusk. Inside a nearby tavern, two merchants sip watered wine and debate the crisis with exaggerated hand gestures. One insists that pirates off the coast of Carthage hijacked the latest Tyrian shipment. The other swears it's divine punishment for last week's eclipse. Juno's mad, he hisses, then belches. She hates when people wear her color on discount. You slide past them and out into the sun, which now feels oddly judgmental, too bright, too unforgiving on colors that used to blend confidently with shadows. You pass a temple with a banner being unfurled. It's meant to honor Mars, god of war. It's pink. Not blush, not rose, just pink. The priest scowls like someone's poured vinegar into his goblet. Historians still argue whether the dye scarcity caused genuine civic unrest or just fashion panic. One scroll references a riot of tailors in the forum. Another claims it was merely a competitive embroidery competition gone awry. Whatever the truth, the disruption is real. You follow the trail of discontent into the markets. A woman inspects purple-dyed sandals, then smirks. "These'll melt in rain," she says, "and turn my feet into royalty." She buys them anyway. The seller throws in a lavender scarf for her goat. It's unclear whether he means that literally. Fringe theories emerge like mushrooms after a storm. Some claim that Rome's elite stockpiled the last of the real dye and are selling diluted versions to the public. Others insist a dye cult is hoarding the secret recipe in a bathhouse basement guarded by eunuchs with terrible tempers. You're not sure which part of that sentence is less believable. You duck into a candlemaker's shop where two young apprentices are experimenting with pigments. What if one whispers, "We paint over red with blue"? The other blinks. "Won't that make brown?" They try it anyway. The result is a murky sludge that smells vaguely of cinnamon and regret. Outside, you pass a group of school children chanting verses in unison. Their tunics are identical shades of tired gray. One of them sighs and mutters, "My uncle said purple makes you smarter." The boy beside him snorts, "My uncle said purple makes you broke." You reach a small courtyard where a scribe is addressing a gathering. Color, he says dramatically, is perception. Status, a hallucination shared by polite society. Someone coughs. Someone else asks if that's why his sandals don't match. The scribe glares. These are intentional asymmetry. Later, you walk through a perfumery that once prided itself on purple-themed oils, lavender iris, crushed fig blossom. Now the shelves are bare, and the proprietor is trying to rebrand as a neutral fragrance boutique. She hands you a sample vial labeled Imperial Memory. It smells like wet marble. In the richer districts, rumors have reached fever pitch. One senator is said to be dyeing his linens in secret with beetroot and then staging moonlit dinners so no one can see the color properly. Another is allegedly paying a Gallic magician to summon purple from crushed snail dreams. You suspect that last one was misheard over wine. You pause by the Tiber and watch a boat unload crates. The crowd presses forward, breath held. Guards form a barrier. A magistrate steps up, unseals a crate, and there it is. Dye jars. Real ones. Or at least real-looking. The crowd surges. A woman faints. A child bites someone. Later, it's revealed the shipment is mislabeled. The jars are filled with pickled onions. One man swears he saw purple in the brine, but nobody believes him. Still, you sense the city shifting. Jokes are sharper, tunics bolder. Someone paints their doorway a kind of hopeful plum. Someone else wears blue on purpose and dares people to notice. At a quiet fountain, a teenage girl sits cross-legged sewing tiny stitches into a sash. "I don't care what shade it is," she mutters, "as long as I made it." She dips her needle in berry dye and keeps going. The thread glints in the sunlight. You almost think it's purple. You follow the scent of boiling linen down a narrow alley where a dyer named Marcellinus is elbow-deep in a vat of something that looks like soup and smells like betrayal. He gives you a nod without looking up. "It's elderberry this week," he says with a hint of indigo. "Maybe." He stirs with a stick that once may have been a flute. In the old days, his father made real Tyrian purple shipped in from Phoenician harbors by greasy-fingered traders and guarded like gold. But those snails are long gone, over-harvested, overboiled, possibly cursed. Historians still argue whether Tyre ever truly ran dry, he mutters, or if someone just stopped paying the sailors. He lifts a square of cloth and squints at it. "Too wine," he says. "Not enough dusk." He drops it back into the pot like a disappointed fisherman releasing a minnow. Outside, you spot a faded fresco of Neptune trident-raised robe, once a radiant violet. Now it looks like damp lilac. The artist probably cried when the wall flaked, or laughed depending on their sense of humor. You're beginning to realize that color isn't just luxury here, it's currency, identity, mood board, and unspoken insult. A soldier in a bleached tunic draws less attention than a baker in maroon stripes. And yet, everyone notices the baker. You cross into the temple quarter where priests and priestesses attempt to navigate liturgical clothing crises. At the temple of Vesta, an acolyte pins a borrowed sash to her robe, muttering that Jupiter doesn't mind mismatched tones if your soul is aligned. Someone nearby whispers that a colorless ceremony last week caused a hiccup in the harvest moon cycle. You can't prove it didn't. Further along, a priestess chants beside a stone altar draped in what can only be described as ambitious mauve. She adjusts it every few minutes, hoping the light will change its mood. "It looked imperial at sunrise," she sighs. A scroll merchant in the plaza is selling a handwritten guide titled "How to Spot True Purple When There Is None." It includes helpful illustrations of grapes, bruises, and the rare morning sky. One page shows a snail. Another says simply, "If you must ask, it's not real." Back in the forum, a self-declared philosopher is giving a public sermon titled "Hue and You, a Crisis of Civic Identity." He gestures wildly at the statues, many of which are now draped in cloaks dyed from crushed figs or fermented beet. "We are living in a chromatic illusion," he cries. "What even is royal if every toga looks like soup?" Someone throws a fig at him. Irony, you suspect. At the baths, the gossip flows faster than the steam. One matron whispers that her neighbor has started steeping grape leaves in vinegar to get that elusive plum tone. Her curtains turned puce, she confides, horrified. Her husband left for the countryside. You pass a group of children playing purple or pretend. One child flashes a sash and the others vote. "Too red," they shout. "Try again." The boy pouts. Another child proudly waves a scrap dyed with boiled iris roots. Everyone gasps. Almost. You follow the river bank where a lone weaver works quietly under a poplar. His loom sings like a sleepy bird. The fabric he's making is soft gray-blue, almost lavender in the right breeze. He doesn't name the color. He just weaves and hums. There's a certain comfort in how the city adapts. No riots, no royal proclamations, just subtle shifts. Markets adjusting. Temple robes mutating street vendors coining new shade names like divine eggplant or senatorial plum to keep the myth alive. A fringe theory circulating among poets suggests that the gods themselves have withdrawn purple from mortal eyes, jealous perhaps, or playful. One bard insists that true violet can now only be seen in dreams, and that artists who glimpse it are cursed to forget their own names. You half hope that's true. At a candlelit dinner that evening, a senator's wife declares her tunic Imperium Twilight. It's brown. No one corrects her. Politeness has become a new pigment. The fishmonger down the street dyes his apron with squid ink now. He calls it Octavian Gray. He says it makes the fish look fresher, though he might just enjoy the sound of it. You drift past a tavern where minstrels are performing an ode to a lost tunic. The chorus rhymes Tyrian with delirium, which is both historically inaccurate and oddly catchy. A drunk man sobs into his stew. As night deepens, the city seems to soften around the edges. Even the graffiti, usually rude and vibrant, is fading into chalky pastels. You spot one tag on a bakery wall that reads, "Purple was a state of mind." You pause beneath an archway and look up. The stars are just coming out faint pinpricks in the black. One glows violet, maybe. Or maybe your eyes are tired. And somehow that's enough for now. The sun rises over a Rome unsure of its palette, and you find yourself walking through the Subura district, less marbled villas, more stacked balconies, and suspicious puddles. Here among fishwives and cobblers, color has always been a luxury whispered about, not lived in. But even the poorest households now display a scrap of fabric, an armband, a curtain tie, a tunic dyed with something close enough to royalty to pretend. You pass a laundry stall where a woman is wringing out linen soaked in red cabbage water. They say if you add chalk, it shifts toward plum, she grumbles, if you don't mind the smell. She holds up a piece that looks more like damp thistle than anything else. For funerals, she adds with a shrug, you watch as a boy carefully mixes onion skin dye in a cracked amphora. He sprinkles an ash, then pauses as though listening to some secret language of hues. My father said emperors wore colors that sang "he tells you." This one hums, maybe. Historians still argue whether the dye crisis reached the provinces or if it was more of an urban panic centered in Rome's vanity quarter. But evidence shows even border towns began experimenting with alternative tints. One governor in Gaul issued an edict rebranding violet as New Republican Gray, while in Britannia, a rogue priest declared that all shades were illusions and banned dye entirely. That didn't last long. Someone painted their sheep. As you wind toward the Aventine Hill, the smell of wood smoke and beetroot hangs in the air. In one villa courtyard, a scholar has assembled scrolls, seashells, and samples of linen under filtered light. He claims to have developed a mathematical formula for calculating perceived royalness in a pigment. You peer at the parchment and find sketches of snails, sun angles, and oddly a chicken wearing a sash. He offers you a demonstration holding up 2 bolts of fabric. One is dyed with blackberries and smells like summer regret. The other, steeped in a mix of wine and ash, seems to change color depending on your opinion of it. This one scored a high provincial noble, he says proudly. The other confused senator's bathrobe. You thank him and drift on. At a nearby market, the vendors have given up on honesty and are leaning into performance. One robe is described as ancient empire plumblood. Another midnight fig mirage. A toga is touted as worn by a descendant of Hercules. You don't ask for proof. The man selling it has a unibrow you dare not challenge. Quirkier still is the rise of purple-themed poetry competitions. In the Forum, Boarium, aspiring bards gather to perform under the banner of the Violet Muse. Today's prompt, the last purple scarf in Ostia. One contestant describes the scarf as dripping with sunset arrogance. Another claims it was so majestic it burned the eyes of cowards. The crowd claps softly because it's Rome and decency is decorum, even in metaphor. In a nearby garden, an old widow points to her flowering hyacinths. These are truer than any dye, she says. They don't lie. They bloom, they fade, and they do not invoice. She pets a nearby cat, whose fur might on a generous day be called taupe. Meanwhile, at the Senate, the debate has gone from economic to existential. A scroll is passed around, containing definitions of purple 13 variations, some poetic, others chemical ones suspiciously copied from a wine label. One senator stands and asks, "If all purples are impostors, are we too not impostors of Rome?" Someone coughs. A guard sneezes. The scroll is quietly tucked under a stack of bills about aqueduct repairs. In the city's textile district, a guild of dyers is forming something like a union. They call themselves the Shades. Their logo: a snail and a wine cup crossing paths under a crescent moon. Their mission to redefine luxury as effort rather than pigment. Their motto: if it took 3 days and half a kitchen to brew, it's regal enough. You pass a quiet chapel where nuns are embroidering altar cloths with threads soaked in mulberry juice and hope. One sister shows you a swatch that's gone gray in the middle. It looked majestic yesterday, she sighs, but then Sister Amara prayed too hard near it. It faded. By the port, a merchant from Alexandria unloads bolts of fabric and loudly proclaims, "I bring the last real purple in the world." A crowd gathers. He unfurls the cloth. It's blue, deep marine, and honest. There's a long silence before someone whispers, "Maybe. It's just the idea of purple that matters now." You walk the edge of the Tiber as the wind picks up. In the water's reflection, a flock of birds passes overhead. Their wings flash with faint, fleeting lavender in the low sun. Or maybe it's just dust on your lashes. Somewhere behind you, a child laughs and shouts, "Mama, I made purple from crushed berries." The mother gasps. You turn. The tunic is a messy patchwork of stains, bright and loud and definitely not Tyrian. But it is joyful. And right now, that's probably enough. You wander into the forum as twilight approaches, that gentle hour when marble glows soft gold and arguments echo with less conviction. It's a slower Rome now, less bustling, more brooding. Everyone's talking dye shortages, but no one quite knows who's to blame. You overhear snippets of conversation: the snails sabotaged. No, it's the Etruscan curse, they warned us. I heard Caligula drank the last barrel of extract on a dare. Historians still argue whether Rome's imperial dye production truly collapsed in a single season, or if this so-called purple panic was more of a drawn-out cultural shift. But records hint at something sudden disrupted sea trade routes. A shipwreck off the coast of Tyre, a suspicious fire in a key dye works, the kind of coincidences that make you squint a little and start muttering about senators with fabric monopolies. You pass a marble plinth where someone has scrawled, "Royal is a state of mind," in red ochre. Below it, a smaller scribble, but purple's still better. A few paces on, you spot a huddle of togaed philosophers gathered around a brazier. Their robes are mostly cream now, neutral, uncontroversial. The leader, an older man with a beard that could host nesting sparrows, lifts a clay cup and murmurs, "If no one sees you in purple, are you still powerful?" His student replies, "Only if your sandals squeak importantly." Nearby, a woman in a toga dyed a bruised shade of grape steps up onto a crate and begins a dramatic recitation. Her poem is called Ode to the Absent Hue. You catch phrases like "thrown silent shoulders" and "violet ghosts in laundry baskets." The audience is too sleepy to clap, but a dog barks once in approval. You head toward the Palatine Hill, where the air smells faintly of roasting onions and crushed petals. Word has spread about underground dyers, the whisper network of alchemists and amateurs who are not ready to give up on imperial glamour. In one dark alley, a woman pulls aside a curtain and reveals her stash bundles of herbs, fermented bark wine lees, and a jar labeled beetle essence probably. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. The beetle looked royal. A fringe tidbit floats to you through the street chatter. Some people believe the true color of divinity has never been purple, but something else entirely shifting, mood-driven, impossible to trap in cloth. One fringe cult refers to it as the color between breaths. They wear plain linen and claim only the blind can truly perceive it. It's either very profound or someone's elaborate prank. Still in an unassuming corner stall, you spot something extraordinary. A single sash undyed simple wool. It's displayed on a marble slab like treasure. The vendor smiles. It's honest, and that's fashionable now. You run your fingers across it. It's scratchy. It smells like smoke. It's perfect. From a balcony overhead, a senator's wife leans out and mutters, "They wore purple because they could afford it, not because it was pretty." She lifts a cup and sips. Now we wear imagination. In one of the quieter neighborhoods, you stumble across a makeshift museum, really just someone's atrium with labeled fabric swatches pinned along the walls. There's lavender dignity, faded port wine remorse, lost consul, and your personal favorite snail's last wish. A small clay dish contains a sample of the original Tyrian dye, dried brittle, dark as betrayal. You're not allowed to touch it. You do anyway. It crumbles like old secrets. Just beyond you, enter a courtyard where tailors are hosting a contest. The goal: replicate imperial purple using anything except snails. There's a blackberry reduction with a vinegar glaze. There's mulberry mustard ink on wool. One entry is simply a rock painted with wine and glitter. A judge squints and calls it bravely abstract. A soft-voiced man in the crowd murmurs, "Maybe purple was never about the color. Maybe it was about the effort it took." You nod even though you're not entirely sure what he means. It sounds wise enough for Twilight. You notice a woman sketching designs on a scroll. She's inventing a new fashion code, 3 slashes on a sleeve to mean retired from empire, a folded hem as a symbol of mourning the snails. Her daughter nearby is dyeing cloth with plum juice and sprinkling it with glittering dust. It's uneven. It's gorgeous. Down the street, a comedy troupe is rehearsing a new satire, Purplegate. It features a fictional emperor whose robe keeps changing colors mid-speech. They rehearse a line, "Let the empire tremble for my toga is..." Taupe cue dramatic music and exaggerated gasps. It's a hit in the making. You pause near a vine-covered wall where someone has painted a mural of a snail carrying the empire on its back. It's absurd. It's beautiful. The snail wears a tiny crown. You salute it. In the distance, someone strikes a lyre. A faint wavering melody wafts through the stone corridors. A song begins, "Bring back the bloom of thunder shells." You can't hear the rest, but the tune stays with you. You wander into a shop where a fabric merchant leans over his stall and whispers, "Want to see something forbidden?" He lifts a flap. It's a sash dyed so deep, so vivid, it almost hums. Made from midnight ink and the tears of someone who tried to make rent-selling turnips, he says. You blink. He winks. Limited edition. As the lamps begin to flicker on, you walk back toward the city center. You notice more people in homemade hues now. Plums, wines, rusts, faded roses. No one's pretending anymore. But somehow that honesty looks more regal than ever. And as the last light fades from the sky, you realize the panic is softening. Rome hasn't run out of purple. It's just recalibrating. You wake into the next scene with the smell of damp stone and aging parchment curling in the corners of your imagination. Down a narrow alley hidden behind a mosaic of an octopus juggling amphorae, you discover what was once a bureaucrat's dye archive. Not the stuff of political thrillers, unless you're into faded inventories and moldy spreadsheets written in Latin. Inside shelves sag under papyrus scrolls, cataloging every batch of purple dye processed for 3 decades straight. Historians still argue whether this room was run by an overzealous accountant or a guild of temple scribes, but either way, Someone took snail tracking very seriously. You run your finger along a ledger batch 312, shipment delayed, too many legs. That's either a mistranslation or a very anxious intern describing snails. You crouch beside a box labeled color experiments. Do not touch. You touch it. Of course you do. Inside test swatches stained with crushed elderberries, sea kelp, and something labeled simply bathtub 9. Most are disappointing shades of bruise and boredom, but one, just one glows faintly in the dim light. You smell it. Regret. Definitely vinegar involved. Back out in the street, you pass a trio of laundry workers draped in tunics still faintly purple despite years of use. They tell you the trick is storing cloth with rosemary and citrus peel, keeps the moths out and makes the toga smell like regret and soup. You make your way toward the Aventine where temple workers have taken over an abandoned dye factory. The once acrid vats now hold sun tea and pickled onions. On one wall, graffiti reads, "We worshipped color. Then we grew up." Another hand has added, "But bring it back anyway." One scholar you overhear swears the real reason the dye dried up was cosmic punishment for overcharging senators. He gestures wildly with a paintbrush dipped in ochre and says, "When the gods can't afford your fashion, you've overplayed your hand." His companion nods solemnly and steals his bread. You duck into a courtyard workshop where a woman known only as Velia has started a school. Not for dyeing, but for dye storytelling. Every student wears an undyed cloak and listens in silence as she recounts the emotional journeys of colors lost. This one, she whispers, pointing to a swatch, is Perseverance on Laundry Day. They write poems about it in silence. One student weeps into a bowl of crushed berries. The wind picks up, sending a shiver down the alleyway, and you follow it toward the ancient markets. There, amidst fruit vendors and fishmongers, a stall displays bowls of snail shells, empty polished, some carved into tiny cameos. A woman sells them as necklaces. "Wear history," she says, "just not near a seagull." Your feet carry you to a curious little bathhouse where no one bathes. Instead, it's been converted into an emotional support group for those who wore purple when it mattered. A former senator sobs gently into a wool scarf. "I used to command provinces," he sniffs. "Now my sash is lilac." A chorus of voices murmurs, "We see you." You linger by the entrance listening to them pass around tales of laundry mishaps and toga tragedies. One tells the story of how his robe turned chartreuse after a thunderstorm. Another admits he once wore plum to a funeral and was mistaken for a wine merchant. You want to laugh, but then you realize there's something comforting about how seriously they take it all. You're led onward by the scent of crushed herbs and smoke. A temple of Minerva has reopened as a color lab. Monks, well ex-monks. Now technically, they wear beige, are performing meditative rituals using scented oils and seasonal pigments. One murmurs, "We cannot resurrect the dye, but we can remember its mood." They swirl, oil chant lightly, and nod like they've cracked the fabric of the cosmos through lavender oil. A side room contains preserved scraps of Emperor Elagabalus's robes kept under glass, slightly faded. A placard reads, "Caution purple may appear less purple than in your dreams." A fringe belief is whispered among the staff that true purple can only be seen at dawn when sunlight hits dew-stained wool at a precise 42-degree angle. You try not to blink at dawn tomorrow, just in case. Outside, a small child plays hopscotch using tiles dyed with old beet juice. She sings 1 for the snail, 2 for the cloak, 3 for the emperor, who always spoke. Her father rolls his eyes and hands you a beet cookie. It's earthy. Night settles in again. You pass a bonfire gathering near the city walls where former tailors toss scraps of faded robes into the flames. "A farewell to fashion tyranny," one of them declares. Another just mutters, "Finally room in the dye budget for socks." And before you go, you find yourself drawn to the edge of the Tiber. Reflections shimmer in the black water, orange bronze, a single flicker of plum. Or maybe it's just the wine. Still, you smile. The color hasn't vanished, it's just hiding better now. You rise as early as a dream ghost in sandals can manage, and find yourself near the outskirts of Rome at the cracked gates of what was once a villa belonging to the wealthy Gaius Valerius Septimus, a man infamous not for politics, but for his towering wardrobe. The man wore more purple than grapes in a festival parade. If you'd seen him back in the day, you'd think someone had dipped a statue in Tyrian ink and taught it to walk, like it owned all the olives. Now his estate is overgrown. Vines creep along once marble columns, the kind that used to echo with laughter, flattery, and just enough scandal to require wine. You wander inside where caretakers have turned his ruined closet into a museum. No joke. There's an exhibit called When Cloaks Got Cocky. You pause in front of a faded toga, more gray than purple now, with a placard that says this garment allegedly caused 3 duels and 1 inconvenient marriage. Mainstream historical records confirm Gaius helped fund Tyrian dye caravans from Phoenicia, storing amphorae in vaulted basements to age like wine. He claimed it made the color more emotionally complex. Historians still argue whether that meant anything or was just Roman rich guy nonsense. Either way, it caught on. Purple became the taste of luxury and, like all things overindulged it, soured fast. Upstairs, you tiptoe into his private study. An oddly intimate place lined with samples from dye labs around the empire, some in glass, others pressed between waxed scrolls. One box is labeled experimental shell-free substitutes. Inside, wilted flowers, sea mud, and something that might be boiled carrot. You inhale deeply, regret. Still, the effort is touching. Even the elite were desperate to keep the magic going. A servant's diary. Anonymous, scribbled in the margins of a scroll about pickling, is on display under glass. The final entry reads, "He cried when the last tunic faded. He said the city would turn to dust. Then he asked for a fig tart." Touching and mildly dramatic. Classic Gaius. Wandering back toward the heart of the city, you pass the dye merchant quarter, or what remains. Once bustling with shouting men carrying vats and sloshing buckets, now reduced to quiet workshops with dusty shutters. A few still operate, repurposed for cloth and colors no one wrote poems about. Yellow, green, beige. One shop advertises weather-resistant brown. You do not enter. Yet in the back alley, an elderly woman named Tulla still sells snail shells. Not for dyeing, just as tokens of a lost era. Hold one, she instructs. Close your eyes. You'll hear the ocean whisper that it used to be fabulous. You do as told. You hear a faint pop and fizz. Could also be a carbonated fig drink, no way to be sure. You walk north to an open-air forum where tailors now gather weekly for what can only be described as support group meets fashion show. They showcase modern takes on Roman wear using plant-based pigments. Deep plums made of mulberry juice, dull violets. Courtesy of red cabbage rinsed twice in moonlight. They clap politely, sigh dramatically, and exchange color names like poetry. Grape memory evening dust, purple adjacent. One garment notably bland is held up and introduced as our collective lowered expectations. The crowd nods in approval. Someone sobs softly into a scarf. In a dusty corner, a street philosopher preaches to a handful of listeners seated on upturned crates. Purple was power, yes, but also pressure, he says, scratching his beard with a spoon for emphasis. We chased a color that was never meant to be chased. A pigeon lands on his shoulder. He calls it Marcus Aurelius. It poops with impressive timing. You settle on a marble bench near a dried-up fountain. A child draws shapes in the dust with a stick, singing softly about emperors and snails. You join in on the refrain even though you've never heard it before. Somehow, you still know the words. Even the graffiti on the city's aging walls tells the story. Bring back purple, someone scrawled under an arch. Underneath, in a different hand, why it always stained the furniture. Another tag reads simply, Hue interrupted. You follow the winding path toward the Vestal Temple ruins where someone started planting purple wildflowers in the cracks between stones. Some petals even resemble the old imperial shade if you squint or tilt your head or wear tinted glasses made from wine bottles. A young woman gently harvests a blossom, places it in a pouch, and says, for memory, not for fashion. As dusk descends again over the crumbling rooftops, you realize this city, for all its theatrics, has made peace with the loss. Or maybe it hasn't, but it's rehearsing acceptance like a stage play. There's dignity in that, even if some still clutch their lilac linens like secret lovers. You pass one final stall where a man sells dyed ribbons made not from sea creatures but boiled fig skins and blackberry peels. I call this one Emperor Regret, he says. You buy it anyway, May? Why not? And with that, you walk slowly into the evening hush. Rome didn't fall today. It just faded one pigment at a time. You leave the scent of old dye vats behind and wander into the quieter districts areas, where the drama of lost colors gives way to something more introspective. The cobblestones feel warmer here, like they've absorbed 1,000 forgotten footfalls. You pass the remnants of what used to be a school for scribes, a place where young Romans learned to write with styluses and ink and occasionally doodled toga-wearing goats in the margins. Inside, dust floats like ash in the late sunlight. One wall still bears a faint mural Apollo handing a scroll to a very tired-looking librarian. There's something poetic about that. You sit on a broken bench beneath it and imagine the students who once crammed their brains full of Latin conjugations and imperial timelines. Purple is for emperors a ghost teacher might have lectured, and also for scaring tax collectors into respecting your aura. Historians still argue whether purple garments alone granted legal privilege. Some claim citizens could avoid conscription if they wore a sufficiently rich shade. Others argue it was mostly myth, one woven and rewoven like imperial tapestry. Either way, the children believed it. And belief, as always, colored history more vividly than fact. You walk past the empty library annex where scrolls once rustled like restless leaves. Only fragments remain, one about trade routes along the Levantine coast, another detailing snail farming techniques suspiciously close to romantic poetry. One battered text discusses alternative dyes, beet juice, crushed insects, fermented figs, and once alarmingly boiled owl feathers. That last one might have been a prank. You descend a narrow stairwell into what was once a storage chamber, now overtaken by candlelit altars and offerings. Not religious, more nostalgic. Little jars of faded fabric, bronze thimbles, a child's tunic stitched in a desperate imitation of Tyrian sheen, now patchy and soft as old parchment. You touch it gently. It smells faintly of lavender and salt. A man in ceremonial robes, white with faint plum trim, probably artificial, steps out of the shadows and nods in greeting. You've come to see the last votive thread, he says. You blink. You've come for less. He gestures to a velvet-lined niche holding a single, hair-thin purple strand suspended in wax. We keep it not for color but for memory. You ask how it survived? He smiles. It didn't. But we needed to pretend something did. That feels oddly profound, or just sleepy. Outside, the air shifts cooler. You follow a procession of musicians playing low wooden flutes and dragging lengths of undyed cloth behind them. They're part of a modern cult called the Order of the Faded Robes. Their doctrine: wear the absence of color to feel its loss more deeply. It's a bit much, but the music is nice. A young member offers you a drink, chilled rosewater with fig extract and a drop of violet syrup. It's our nod to the old imperial palate, she whispers, as if it might still be illegal. You sip. It tastes like flowers falling asleep. You drift toward the river where boats used to offload snail shipments under guard. No one trusted a purple merchant not to sneak a little extra dye into their personal stash. One legend says a senator once dyed his cat imperial purple as a protest. The cat was unimpressed. Now, the harbor is still. Old crates serve as benches for a handful of amateur philosophers arguing about legacy. Did Rome lose purple, or did purple lose Rome, one asks. If you dye a new robe, the old color, is it the same empire another counters? You don't join in. You're too busy wondering how they all ended up quoting Seneca while barefoot and slightly wine-drunk. Historians still debate whether the color shortage was economic sabotage or simply natural over-harvesting. Some blame trade wars, others blame climate change along mollusk-rich shores. A fringe theory involves solar flares making the dye unstable. That one's bold. You follow the path along the riverbank to an old garden where a retired dyer named Nerva cultivates plants for pigment experiments. He doesn't miss the snails, he says. Too judgmental. He lifts a leaf and shows you the underside stain purple from natural enzymes. Give me patience and compost, and I'll show you royalty. You help him stir a vat with a stick shaped like a shepherd's crook. Steam rises. It smells of wet moss, pepper, and triumph. We'll never get the same shade, he murmurs, but maybe we don't need to. As night deepens, you settle beneath a fig tree that watches over Nerva's garden like a sleepy giant. Stars blink into view, some white, some faintly tinted like spilled ink in the sky. You lie back on a worn stone bench, still warm from the sun, and stare upward. Above you, the constellations whisper stories in the silence of emperors, draped in dreams of tailors who stitched illusions of snails, who unknowingly built empires one drop at a time. And maybe, just maybe, of you wandering through the fragments, still looking for color in the quiet. You wake well not fully from your half-nap under Nerva's fig tree, feeling the whisper of something ancient in the breeze. The scent of wet soil clings to your sleeves, and somewhere in the distance, someone is reciting Virgil to a group of drowsy chickens. You've seen stranger things in Roman ruins. From Nerva's garden, your feet carry you down a path bordered by low walls, their mosaics chipped but still proud. You pass a sun-dried basin where dye workers once rinsed imperial fabrics, its inside stained a stubborn burgundy. It's said no amount of scrubbing could return the marble to white, not even the lye soap made from goat fat and crushed shells. But honestly, who would want to erase such evidence? The conversation turns inward. You wonder what it meant to wear purple, not just in color, but in responsibility. Imagine stepping into a tunic so rare it signaled you might be sacrificed politically next week, a toga that doubled as both wardrobe and target. And still, people fought for it. Historians still argue whether emperors used purple to cement legitimacy or to blind their rivals in textile-based intimidation. Some say the color was so potent it made enemies forget their plans. Others say it just helped you look taller at parades. Either way, purple became as much a performance as a pigment. The bureaucracy surrounding the dye became hilariously complex. One preserved letter from a provincial governor details a request for 20 amphorae of not quite purple to avoid arrest. The Romans even invented a secondary category of dye called marginally plum, which according to law could be worn by relatives of purple wearers, but only during Saturnalia. Yes, it was exactly as confusing as it sounds. You cross into a quiet cloister near what used to be the Imperial Tailors Guild, once a flurry of wax tablets, swatches, and high-stakes gossip. There's a cracked sundial in the center courtyard. Someone's left a slice of bread and an olive pit on it as an offering, maybe, to the ghost of a disappointed fashion designer. Inside the workshop, the shadows still wear the shape of draped cloth. You can almost hear the snip of bronze shears, the rhythmic scrape of dye being stirred with a hollowed-out bone. There's something humbling about imagining how much effort it took to dye a single hemline. 1,000 snails, a month of boiling, a week of drying. all for a cuff someone might never notice unless it was slightly uneven. You pause before a stone table etched with patterns, some geometric, others oddly suggestive of squids doing synchronized swimming. A tablet nearby records a forgotten fabric recipe involving fig vinegar fish scales and the light of a full moon. No one knows if it worked. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of moonlight was literal metaphorical or part of an ancient tax deduction loophole. Out back, there's a faded fresco of the Emperor Caracalla tearing his robe in anger. Beneath him, the caption reads, "Too much plum." I said thundercloud. The tailor's revolt shortly after this incident may or may not have involved replacing his wardrobe with various shades of spite. You wander through the dye storage vaults now, cool and echoing like cathedrals. Amphorae line the walls labeled in shaky Latin. Shells, very purple shells, not so much, and one simply marked, "Oops." You lift a lid and find it empty, but still fragrant, briny, and nostalgic like seaside regret. A small alcove houses tools, used in the dye process sieves, made of woven reeds. Mortars for crushing, long-handled ladles for stirring, bubbling vats. One ladle bears a carving of a snail wearing a laurel crown. It's absurdly dignified. You give it a respectful nod. A side passage leads to a chapel once used by the dyers. Above the altar, there's a mural of a hand reaching down from the heavens, dipping a robe into a jar labeled imperium in coloribus. You sit in the pews and consider how much meaning was packed into that tiny flask of dye. It was never just fashion, it was philosophy, economics, politics, and sometimes petty personal vendettas. You imagine a toga so deeply purple, it sparkled in lamplight, reserved for the moment an emperor declared new law, or maybe just declared a new soup. Because when you control the color everyone wants, every gesture becomes a little more dramatic. Out the chapel's back door, a staircase leads down into a flooded basement. The walls are lined with racks where garments once dried. You tiptoe through ankle-deep water, the reflections shimmering like ink. A frog croaks in the corner, probably descended from a long line of bureaucratic assistants. You find an old ledger floating face down. Carefully, you lift it from the water. The ink has run, but one line remains legible. "He who dares wear purple without merit shall be remembered only for the stain." A bit heavy-handed, but poetic. You leave it open on a stone, hoping the words will dry into something legible for the next wanderer. By the time you resurface, night has deepened. The city sighs in its sleep. Lamps flicker in the windows of buildings too proud to collapse. You pass a woman, painting with crushed berries, trying to recreate lost tones. She offers you a brush. You add a streak of color, not purple, but close. Plumish. Enough. As you return to the streets, you catch your reflection in a bronze shield propped against a wall. For a moment, the faint, reddish tinge of your robe under the moonlight almost looks imperial. You smile. You're not an emperor, just a sleepwalker through forgotten dyes, echoing workshops, and a world once ruled by snails and silk. You drift back toward the heart of the old market toes, brushing the cracked stones of a plaza where once, if memory serves, entire auctions were held for purple garments alone. Not for the wearers, just the garments. They'd be paraded out on wooden stands like prized hunting dogs, their hems fluttering in the wind, their stitchwork examined through polished copper mirrors. One senator reportedly fainted at the sight of a competitor's cloak having a deeper hue. It was that serious. A gust of wind tugs at your sleeve as if to remind you that prestige is at best seasonal. You sidestep a half-buried milestone and enter a square dominated by a now silent fountain. A few pigeons hold an emergency summit at its edge. The water hasn't flowed in centuries, but once it bubbled with wine during festivals, diluted wine, mind you. Romans had budgets too. Beside the fountain is what remains of the Guild of Color Keepers. An impressive name for what was essentially a club of men who argued over dye brightness under lamplight. They carried official wax tablets and wore pins shaped like amphorae. Some were honored enough to be buried with their favorite stirring sticks. One even had a miniature vat carved onto his tombstone. The guild had strict regulations. Dye mixtures had to be documented with poetic flair. One finger of dusk, one recipe begins a sigh of sea foam and just enough thunder. Historians still argue whether these were actual measurements or the fever dreams of someone who took perfume making too seriously. You step into the collapsed ruins of their meeting hall. Beneath your feet, crushed shells crunch faintly. Some purple snails had to be imported from the eastern coastlines, modern-day Lebanon mostly. Entire fleets set sail just to gather them with special nets, padded crates, and little water tanks that had to be sprinkled with salt twice a day. Any less and the snails got cranky, according to one surviving log. There's a marble slab at the center of the hall engraved with rules. Rule 7 is just the word "don't" in all caps. Rule 9 oddly mentions cheese, perhaps a forgotten inside joke. Or maybe they just believed in snacking responsibly. You follow a corridor that once led to the imperial storerooms. It's quiet here, too quiet save for the occasional bat sneeze echoing from above. Walls that once housed bolts of rare cloth are now bare, save for hooks and faint shadows of rust. But if you squint, you can picture it, the shelves, sagging under the weight of velvet satin linen dyed to within an inch of royalty. You run your fingers along one alcove that holds a dented chest. It creaks open with a cough of dust. Inside, a handful of sea snail shells hollowed and gleaming faintly like miniature amphitheaters. One has a tiny inscription, Lakes a mollusco. Light from a mollusk. Outside, night deepens. The sky is now a heavy wool blanket, with stars stitched in tight, cautious clusters. You pass an old workshop where a child once discovered an accidental new shade by mixing old wine with the wrong snail paste. Imperial grape, they called it. It was banned a month later. Too seductive. Senators were reportedly late to meetings, mesmerized by their own cuffs. You lean against the doorway of what must have been a color testing chamber. No joke, it's built like a small observatory. There's a circular window in the ceiling allowing moonlight to beam in and illuminate swatches pinned along the walls. The idea was to test how the colors looked, not just by torchlight, but by divine starlight. A priest from the Temple of Juno reportedly accused the guild of witchcraft after catching a glimpse of a robe glowing faintly at dusk. Historians still argue whether the luminescent dye was a happy accident, a chemical reaction with fish oil, or the result of someone adding too much wine and getting inspired. You reach a hallway lined with statues of past dye masters, each with smug stone expressions. One clutches a mixing rod like a scepter. Another holds up a perfectly folded napkin, purple of course. And one curiously holds a mirror aimed not at himself, but at the visitor, as if to ask, "Are you worthy of this color?" You smile, half asleep now, half dreaming. What would you have traded for one robe in that era? A house, a field. Your mother-in-law's least offensive goat, probably. After all, to wear purple was to be seen. A final chamber shaped like a nautilus shell opens before you. You step inside slowly. The walls spiral in every surface covered in frescoes of sea creatures and fabric-draped emperors. In the center sits a round pedestal, empty but etched with a line of poetry. The sea gives, the snail bleeds, the empire endures. You exhale. This was never just about color, it was about permanence, about catching time itself and dyeing it to your whim. As you trace your way back through the ruins, the snail's ghosts seem to echo in every footstep. It's not eerie, just persistent, a quiet legacy smeared on togas and whispered into the creases of forgotten curtains. Above the stars shimmer, some say the gods wear purple. Others say they just got better snail suppliers. You leave the spiral chamber behind, retracing your steps through the murky corridors of the dye master's domain. The cool stone underfoot hums faintly, like it's remembering all the colors it once held. You pass back through the testing room where moonlight still filters through the oculus above, casting a pale glow that barely touches the floor. The swatches are long gone, but a few bronze pins cling stubbornly to the wall like they're still waiting for cloth to arrive. Outside, the city has quieted even more, if that's possible. Not even a bat flutters now. It's the kind of hush that makes you question whether the ruins are empty, or just listening very intently. You wander across a courtyard with a chipped mosaic underfoot, its tiles arranged in the swirling shape of a snail. Fitting. You pause and lean close. Just under its coiled tail, you spot a single Latin word, periculum, danger. Probably a joke, but you shuffle on anyway. Cursed mollusks weren't entirely outside the Roman sense of humor. To your left looms the old textile hall. What remains of it anyway? A collapsed roof, a half-standing arch, and a broken loom still slumped against the far wall. But it used to hum with noise. Wooden spindles creaked, workers chatted about weather and wine, and diamasters barked out warnings like, "Don't let that drip touch your sandals unless you want toes the color of Caesar's rage." Inside, it still smells faintly of vinegar and sea air. You almost imagine someone weaving just around the corner a rhythmic back and forth of shuttle and thread. Once upon a time, thousands of purple-dyed garments passed through here on their way to bathhouses, senatorial chambers, and even military camps. Because, yes, nothing says battlefield intimidation like a commander in grape-colored trousers. You find a splintered plank with inked instructions mostly faded, but one sentence still clings to the grain. Never let it boil too fast. That was the golden rule of dye work: heat too high and the color curdled. One dye master called it the purple scream, which is hilarious until you realize they weren't joking. The vats really did make a sound when something went wrong, kind of a hiss mixed with a wet burp. Very demoralizing. Back in the day, apprentices had to memorize dozens of such rules. They weren't written down, not at first. Too risky. Competitors might steal them. So they were taught by song. Imagine a lullaby, but instead of sheep or stars, you're crooning about sea snail mucus and timing your stirs by the beat of your foot on the stone floor. Historians still argue whether these dye songs were standardized or improvised. You murmur amused, but one thing's clear: someone once rhymed crimson with grinsin. A poet, that one. You follow a crumbling hallway that once held barrels of soaking cloth. The walls are stained dark purple, of course, but now more of a ghost color, almost brown. The barrels are gone, but ring marks linger like bruises. Each vat was named after a Roman virtue: fortitudo, temperantia, gravitas. Also, one was called Kevin, no explanation found. Further on, you enter a small alcove carved with spiral motifs, clearly snail-inspired. There, recessed into the wall, is a shrine. A little offering shelf, long unused with faded wax puddles, and a marble hand resting palm up. It might have once held a cup. Or maybe it's just art. You don't ask. The walls are painted with scenes from the myth of Tyrian Purple's discovery, usually credited to Hercules' dog, who chomped a snail during a seaside walk and came away with a very fashionable muzzle. That story, it's half lore, half marketing campaign. The Romans loved a myth that could justify luxury. Nearby, you spot a scrap of a mosaic showing the same story. The dog looks extremely proud of himself. The snail, less so. You step through a doorway that must have led to the vault not for gold, but for the most vibrant samples of cloth ever created in Rome. Some records say that only 3 people had access to it: a senior dye master, a notary, and the emperor's personal robe inspector, which, yes, was apparently a full-time position. In the center of the vault lies an overturned stand once used for judging the fabric's saturation. Rumor had it that if your robe wasn't vibrant enough, you'd be demoted from purple-worthy to eggplant adjacent. The shame. A papyrus scrap pinned to the wall bears the phrase, "To lose the purple is to forget the empire." A tad dramatic, but you respect the energy. You rest here a moment, imagining all the layers of purple that have passed through this room. Cloaks for philosophers, tunics for priests, pillowcases for the kinds of people who got their names carved into aqueducts. And then one day the supply just ran out. No ceremony, no final robe, just dwindling snails, over-harvested coastlines, trade disputes, possibly a few dye mule accidents. Eventually, the empire had to settle for less. They tried cheaper dyes, berries, minerals, crushed insects. It just wasn't the same. Historians still argue whether Rome's obsession with purple contributed to its economic strain. Others think it was just the empire's way of dressing up its decline. Literally, wear something fancy while everything collapses around you. Relatable. You turn to leave the vault. Behind you, the stone hand still waits palm up beneath the faded fresco of Hercules' smug dog. You exit slowly. The air outside is cool and soft. The stars have multiplied, crowding the sky like curious pearls wanting to know what color robes you'd pick if you had the chance. Maybe not purple, maybe something easier to find. But then again, maybe not. You drift back through the ruins with your thoughts stitched in violet. The winding paths of the old dye quarter feel gentler now, softened by starlight and nostalgia. Pebbles crunch quietly underfoot like the snails of Tyre, whispering secrets from beneath the soil. The silence is so complete, you start imagining things: faint laughter from a distant vat room, the squelch of soaked wool being wrung out by calloused hands, the soft, smug bark of Hercules' dog. You'll never unhear that now. Thanks, myth-makers. You find a stone bench beneath a cypress tree and let your weight settle. There's a carved symbol etched into the stone, two snails spiraling together, one clockwise, the other not. Scholars argue whether it's a metaphor for balanced duality or just a dye master with too much time and a sharp chisel. You let your head tilt back against the tree's cool bark and wonder about the last real day of purple. Not the dramatic kind, no riots, no proclamations. Just a day when the last batch was too weak, when the robes came out more plum than imperial. Maybe they called it subtle lilac to save face. A clerk probably logged it in some scroll. Dye quality suboptimal. Client displeased. Recommend beetroot tint trial. The death of an empire, one disappointing robe at a time. And what of the dye masters themselves? When the snails were gone, when the vats cooled, when the purple turned pale, did they retire? Move to making soap. One theory suggests some pivoted to perfumery, their noses too finely tuned to waste. Others became advisors, color consultants for senators, panicking over what to wear now that their toga was well beige. And yet, even in its absence, purple never really disappeared. It lingered. In stories, in scraps, in the corners of forgotten shrines where a scrap of cloth was wedged behind a loose stone, daring time to forget it. You rise and return to the edge of the ruins. The sea is just visible beyond a slope, black and smooth, the waves a barely audible hush. Somewhere in its depths, perhaps one final murex shell clings to a rock, ancient and unaware of its former fame. The wind carries a faint scent, salty with a trace of something older. Not dye exactly, but the memory of it. Your nose twitches. Could be snail. Could be seawater. Could be the amphorae of olives someone spilled here in 217 CE. The layers are hard to separate. One last building awaits, a domed observatory. It wasn't used for stargazing, but for testing how the dye looked under different lights. There were rumors that certain purples glowed faintly by torchlight. The Emperor's shimmer, they called it. No science behind it, just a fun lie with good branding. Inside the dome is cracked, but the geometry remains perfectly circular, lined with shell inlays and gold dust. You imagine a worker walking circles around a hanging robe, torch in hand, checking for consistency. Woe to the apprentice who left a streak. And here, under this dome, you let the weight of history slide over you. Purple was never just a color. It was a ritual, a labor, a status symbol so absurdly expensive, it made people hoard snails, invent myths, and write laws about who could wear what hue. Historians still debate whether Rome's purple laws helped unify the empire or just made people angry. After all, nothing makes someone want something more than being told they can't have it. Purple envy probably not what brought down the empire, but surely it didn't help. You step back out. The horizon is just beginning to smudge with dawn. Not quite color yet, but something like it. Pale rose, dusty bronze, somewhere in between. You descend the final steps from the observatory. Moss clings to the stones now. It too is green, but only until someone finds a way to dye it royal. Below, a faded pillar stands alone. It's carved with a single phrase. In the empire of color, even the sea was ruled. You smile at that. It's grandiose, pretentious, and honestly, a little true. Now the path levels out. No more ruins. Just a trail, quiet and shadowed, leading back to wherever it is you came from. And as you go, you carry with you no robe, no shell, no dye. Just the dream of purple. And now, as the soft hush of Roman sea breezes fades behind you, and the last echoes of snails' cloaks and dye vats dissolve into the air, you let your steps slow. The trail becomes softer, quieter, as if even the earth wants you to rest. Your breath steadies. Your eyelids grow heavy. The world of amphorae and textile laws of color-coded status and ceremonial tunics melts gently into the background. That stone bench beneath the cypress still waits if you ever want to go back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe not. Let the memories of forgotten pigments and seashell dyes wrap you like a light linen robe, soft, faintly salted, and entirely your own. You don't need to chase the empire's shimmer anymore. You've seen it, touched it, laughed at it even. So as you lay back now, wherever you are, feel the quiet settle around you. Let the velvet dark of night feel just a little more royal. Let your thoughts spiral like the shells, slow and silent, until all color drains from them like dye into the sea. And when the last thought fades, may it be gentle, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit purple,